What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back for another A Song of Ice and Fire chapter video. That's right, folks, we are jumping back into the books. As I said before, I will be making a video on each chapter from the A Song of Ice and Fire book series. Since so many of you have been asking me to do something like this for so long, I thought I should finally take your advice. And let's be honest, I needed to read them again anyway because I can barely remember all the small details within these massive novels. Hopefully this will be a very fun learning experience for not only myself, but also for those of you who have not read the books. I'm sure most of you already heard about how different the books are from the show. Now you will finally see why so many fans say the books are better. I hope these videos will give you a good idea of what is happening in each of the books, so go ahead and grab yourself a snack because this is a good one. In this video, we will be discussing the first official chapter in A Game of Thrones. Now we will see the story unfold through Bran Stark's eyes in his first chapter of the book. Some of you might not know this, but what happens in Bran Stark's chapter is actually what led to George R.R. Martin creating this amazing universe that we all know and love so much. He basically said one day he was sitting around and this specific scene entered his head. After writing it down, he thought about it over and over again, which eventually led to him writing these giant novels that make up this incredible story.
This creation began back in 1991, and I know that's a while ago, but I'm hoping you can remember for us the scene or the image that launched the series, A Song of Ice and Fire.
It was the first chapter of the novel Game of Thrones, not the prologue, which actually appears first. I wrote that later, but it was the chapter where they Bran viewpoint and they ride out to see the deserter beheaded, and then they find the direwolf pups in the summer.
Obviously, this had a major impact on George, so you can only imagine how significant this chapter must be to the overall series. It is often said that some of the information in this first book may reveal how it all ends. If Bran Stark does become the king of Westeros in the books as well, then it's no coincidence the story began with his character. He will eventually gain access to all the knowledge in the universe as well as having a connection to every major event that happens. Let's go ahead and begin, so we can see how Bran Stark ends up as one of the main characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. This chapter begins as Bran Stark is getting ready to see his first execution. That's right, Bran Stark goes for a ride-along with Ned Stark's head removal services. It actually says that Bran is excited by the thought of being able to see a man get his head chopped off, which I do find interesting. This goes to show you how normal of a custom this was. In fact, Bran most likely felt left out when his brothers would go with their father to deliver the king's justice, but now that Bran is 7 years old, he is considered old enough to witness the execution. If even only for a brief moment, Bran Stark feels like one of the men. Now we begin to find out who this man actually is, and because of this, we learn some interesting details that will set up things for later in the story. You see, Robb Stark thinks this man might be a wildling. This reminds Bran of some of Old Nan's stories. This is how we learn that Mance Rayder is the king beyond the wall, a character Bran's brother, Jon, will become very familiar with soon enough. Bran also remembers Old Nan's stories about wildling women who would sleep with the White Walkers during the long night, therefore creating these half-human, half-White Walker children. This is brought to our attention on the very first page of the very first chapter. I believe George R.R. Martin is giving us some significant details right away. Many of the Starks do not believe her stories, but as we continue reading through the books, you will begin to see there is some solid evidence for what Old Nan actually says. The White Walkers have been given sacrifices for thousands of years, and we will soon find out Craster is sacrificing his own sons to stay alive out beyond the wall. And, later on in the books, Bran will remember another one of Old Nan's stories about a man known as the Night's King, who was also sacrificing his children to the White Walkers. Now what makes this even more fascinating is the fact that Old Nan is convinced that this Night's King was a member of House Stark. So the groundwork for this revelation is already being laid out in Bran Stark's first chapter. That is most likely why we are introduced to the Starks immediately after the White Walkers resurface after all these years. They have a connection that dates back to the Long Night. This is very interesting because the Starks will become the main family that attempts to defeat the White Walkers, who may share their own blood. When Bran Stark sees the man his father has to execute, he notices something that I wanted you to remember from my last video. You see, When this man is captured, we don't hear him say anything about the White Walkers like we did in the show. Bran Stark does hear them speaking about something, but he doesn't hear what is said. So for all we know, this man could be anyone. But Bran notices something that we were made aware of when we first met Garrett. Bran notices the man has lost his ears and a finger to frostbite, and he's dressed in all black. Now we know it's the same man from the Night's Watch without anyone having to say his name. I love when George reveals information this way. He lets the readers figure things out on their own, instead of giving them all the answers. Another thing I like about this chapter is we learn exactly how old some of the Starks are. They're actually so much younger than they appear to be in the show. As I said before, Bran Stark is 7 years old. Then we find out Ned Stark is only 35 years old. Now it does say he has white hair in his beard, so he does look older than he actually is. Anyways, now we are finally at the moment of execution. Like in the show, Theon Greyjoy hands Ned Stark his sword, Ice. It's a gigantic Valerian steel sword that stands taller than Ned's son, Robb Stark. Now another thing I find interesting is what is said about the sword. It says, "Nothing holds an edge like Valerian steel." This sounds very familiar to what we heard in the last chapter. When Will saw the White Walker's sword, he thought it looked sharper than any razor he had ever seen. It's not a coincidence that we learn about these magical swords in back-to-back chapters at the very beginning of the story. We meet the White Walkers, and we find out they have a magical sword that is different than any other sword. But in the next chapter, we find out House Stark also has a very magical sword that is different than any other sword. This is obviously setting up the inevitable fight between members of House Stark and the White Walkers. These magical swords will eventually clash, and it will be glorious. I also think it's very interesting that the Starks call their sword Ice. You will learn in the books that the name Ice dates back to the Age of Heroes, most likely during the Long Night. The sword that Ned Stark has is only 400 years old, but the Starks have been naming their house sword Ice for thousands of years. And it makes me wonder why they started to do that. I believe it has a connection to the White Walkers and their ultimate defeat during the Long Night. You see, the Stark's house was founded roughly 8,000 years ago, around the same exact time that Winterfell was built, right after the Long Night ended. Now I have made several videos about this over the years, but I think House Stark was set up in Winterfell after they defeated the White Walkers in that location, hence the name Winterfell. I believe that is where the Night King, or the King of Winter, fell. I think this is when the Starks begun to name their sword Ice, symbolizing their victory over the White Walkers. Even though they won, they always knew they might come back, so that's when they started warning everyone that winter is coming, a phrase that later became their house words. Afterwards, the White Walkers fled into the north. Then they built the wall to make sure they could never come back south. However, if the White Walkers somehow made it through the wall, then Winterfell would be the second line of defense. This is exactly why I always said the final battle against the Night King would happen in Winterfell as it did 8,000 years ago. Like I said before, there is a good reason why the Starks get their introduction directly after the White Walkers resurfaced in the story. It's all connected, folks. Now I do have additional evidence for this, but I don't want to get into all of it right now. I will discuss it further as other evidence is revealed throughout the chapters. In fact, I might even release a video about all the different connections between House Stark and the White Walkers. I might even release that video in a few days before I do another chapter video. That way you know exactly what I mean whenever I reference these connections from here on out. But let's move on. Now we are moments away from the execution. This is when we find out who the King of the Seven Kingdoms is, when Ned Stark says,
"In the name of Robert of the House Baratheon, the first of his name.
Don't look away.
King of the Andals and the first
Father will know if you do.
Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm. I, Eddard, of the House Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, sentence you to die."
Since Ned Stark is the Warden of the North, he is responsible for delivering the King's justice in this region of Westeros. Ned Stark is the head of the house that I believe this story is centered around, so it's very important that we meet all of its members very early on in this series. Here is also when we meet Jon Snow, arguably one of the most important members of House Stark. Now, although this is Bran's chapter, it does give us some interesting details about Jon Snow, who is only 14 years old at the beginning of the story. So, Ned Stark executes the deserter from the Night's Watch with one single stroke of his sword. As they are heading back to Winterfell, Robb and Jon have a discussion about the man who was just executed. Robb says, the deserter died bravely, whereas Jon says no, this one was dead of fear. You could see it in his eyes. Then it says, Jon's eyes were a gray so dark they seemed almost black, but there was little they did not see. Remember this line about Jon's eyes for later. I will mention it again at the end of the chapter. It also says Jon was slender, where Robb was muscular, dark, where Robb was fair, graceful and quick, where his half-brother was strong and fast. Then, Jon and Robb begin to race their horses back, and it mentions one other interesting thing about Jon that I want you to remember for later. It says, when they begin to race, Robb was laughing, but Jon was silent and intent. I believe these details about Jon are a direct connection to his direwolf Ghost, who he will find at the end of the chapter. I will explain what I mean once we get there. Now we get to one of my favorite moments from the scene, when Bran and his father discuss the execution. Even if you haven't read the books, I'm sure you will remember this from the show. This is when Bran said to Ned, Robb says the man died bravely, but Jon says he was afraid. This makes Bran think and ask, can a man be brave even if he's afraid? Ned says, that is the only time a man can be brave. Then Ned says, do you understand why I did it? Bran thinks it might be because the man was a wildling, and wildlings are known for kidnapping women and selling them to the others, or the White Walkers. Ned says, the man was an oathbreaker, a deserter from the Night's Watch. No man is more dangerous. The deserter knows his life is forfeit if he is taken, so he will not flinch from any crime, no matter how vile. However, this is not why Ned is asking Bran the question. He isn't asking why the man should die, but why Ned has to be the one to see it through. Ned says, our way is the old way. If you would take a man's life, you owe it to him to look into his eyes and hear his final words. And if you cannot bear to do that, then perhaps the man does not deserve to die. A man who hides behind executioners soon forgets what death is. I love how Ned takes a moment to drop some knowledge on his son by making sure he understands why he had to execute the man. Bran will need to take that lesson with him because one day he might have to do the same thing. Now, although he does sometimes make mistakes, I think this does show that Ned Stark is a good father overall. He appears to be an honest man, who is also lawful, who likes to carry out each and every action with honor and integrity. But as the story begins to unfold, we will see that Ned will have to make some very hard decisions that go against his own code in order to save his loved ones. We will also begin to see that most of Ned's beliefs are in his children as well. In a story that is full of greed, corruption, and backstabbings, the Starks will become one of the families we will look to for some hope. Now let's move on to the final scene of the chapter. As I said before, this was the first image that came to George R.R. Martin when he began writing A Song of Ice and Fire. This is when they find the direwolves in the late summer snows. As Ned and Bran are having their discussion, Jon appears on the crest of the hill before them. He yells for them to follow him. He says, hurry up and see what Robb has found. Ned, Bran, and Jory arrive on scene, where the snows are actually very deep. It says, Robb is knee-deep in the snow, as he is standing there holding something in his arms. When they all see what it is, they're actually kind of afraid. It's not like you stumble across a direwolf every day. These animals are massive, which I think the show did a decent job at getting that across. The dead direwolf that's lying in the snow is so big, it says, it's even bigger than the pony that Bran is riding on in this scene. It was double the size of any of the hounds at Winterfell, which is crazy. This is when we learn that direwolves have not been seen south of the Wall in hundreds of years. In the books to follow, we will begin to see that the Starks finding these direwolves was no accident. As Jon Snow says, the Stark children were meant to have them. They are a gift from the old gods, but more specifically, the Children of the Forest and Blood Raven. They sent these direwolves to keep them safe and help them on their journeys throughout the story. They are the sigil of the Stark's house after all. Each of the direwolves seem to have a deeper connection with their owner. Some would even say the names given to the direwolves foreshadow the future of the Stark children. Either way, it's safe to say the Starks do have a very special bond with their direwolves. I'm not only referring to loyalty either. They have a magical bond that allows them to enter the mind of their animal and see through its eyes. Now in the television show, we only saw Bran Stark have that ability, but in the books you will learn that more than one Stark can do this, but I don't want to start diving into all of that just yet. We have so much more to unfold. I will discuss all of that further as some of the future chapters begin to reveal the evidence laid out for this. So now we are at the moment in which Ned says, "Do you know what killed this animal?" Robb actually gets excited here because he already knows the answer. He did notice there was something stuck in its throat. This is when Ned kneels down and yanks out a foot of shattered antler, then holds it up for all to see. A sudden silence falls over the crowd. The men look at the antler uneasily, and no one dared to speak. Even Bran could sense their fear, though he did not understand. They believe this is a bad sign or omen. This image alone has many different interpretations. You can almost understand why the Starks would feel so uneasy about it. The direwolf is the sigil of their house. Now they find a dead one that should not even be south of the wall in the first place. They might fear this symbolizes the future of their own house, but then there is an added layer to it because the direwolf was killed by a stag, which happens to be the sigil of House Baratheon. Since both animals died, maybe it symbolizes House Stark and House Baratheon killing each other. Either way, Ned Stark has to be thinking, someone better bring me my brown pants. Almost everyone in the scene wants to leave immediately. Even Ned doesn't think they should be taking the direwolves home, but coincidentally enough, it's the Stark children who say otherwise. Maybe they are already starting to feel a connection to the direwolves. Robb Stark gets mad at Theon for wanting to kill them. Bran almost cries when he thinks they will have to leave them behind. And of course, it's Jon who convinces Ned to allow them to take them home. Jon points out there are 5 of them, 3 male and 2 female, which lines up exactly with the Stark children. Jon Snow may know nothing, but even he could see the Starks were meant to have them. He knew this was no accident, which is interesting because earlier in the chapter, Bran even says there was little that Jon's eyes did not see. What makes it even more interesting is what Bran notices when Jon finds Ghost. You see, Jon doesn't find Ghost as fast as he did in the show. They are actually already leaving, and it's when they're halfway across the bridge that Jon hears something in the distance. This causes him to stop, and Jon says, "Don't you hear it?" Bran hears the wind in the trees and the horse's hooves on the ironwood planks, but Jon was listening to something else. Jon swings his horse around and races back across the bridge. Everyone watches Jon dismount, where the mother direwolf was laying dead in the snow. They watch him as he kneels down, and a moment later, he was riding back, only now he was smiling. He must have crawled away from the others, Jon said. Now Jon found Ghost. His fur was white, where the rest of the litter was gray. His eyes were as red as the blood of the ragged man who died this morning. Bran thought it was curious that this direwolf alone would have opened its eyes while the others were still blind. An albino, Theon Greyjoy says. This one will die even faster than the others. Jon says, "I think not. This one belongs to me." Alright, so there is a lot of fascinating things to unpack right here. First, I want to mention some of the similarities between Jon and Ghost. Here it says his fur is white, where the rest of the litter was gray. This shows how Ghost stands out from the rest, similar to Jon, who, as we all know, is not actually Ned's son. Jon is the outcast of the bunch, just like Ghost. Also, Bran said there was little Jon's eyes did not see, and like we learn here, Ghost already had his eyes open, whereas the rest of the litter was still blind. This makes you wonder how much of a connection Jon and Ghost already had. Maybe Jon was already inside the mind of Ghost without even knowing it. I mean, he did somehow hear him after all, when it is said that Ghost is silent. Unlike the other direwolves, Ghost does not bark, and he moves silently on his feet. So how did Jon hear him? Did they already have a magical bond? Most likely. Or maybe something else was happening here. I think something very special was happening when Jon found Ghost. Something that I will not easily be able to explain in this video. I actually already made a video about the reason I think Jon was able to find Ghost the way that he did. I think you will find it to be very interesting if you haven't seen it already. I might release that video again this week while I'm working on the next chapter video, but we shall see. Also, if you remember earlier in the chapter, we hear about Robb and Jon racing on their horses. It said that Robb was laughing, where Jon was silent and intent. Like I said a second ago, Ghost is also known for being very silent, so I think this is another similarity between Jon and Ghost. They both move silently. Also, when it mentions Ghost having his eyes open first, this may symbolize Jon opening his eyes first. Robb said the deserter died bravely, but Jon knew otherwise. He knew the man was afraid of something. We are also told that bastards have to grow up faster than the other children. This may also represent that Jon has some level of maturity before the other children. His eyes are already open to the world around him. In fact, Jon even says, a bastard has to learn to notice things, to read the truth that people hide behind their eyes. So I think this lines up really well with Ghost already having his eyes open, or at least it makes sense to me. One other thing I want to mention is what Theon Greyjoy said about Ghost. He said, an albino. This one will die even faster than the others. Then Jon says, I think not. This one belongs to me. Jon is absolutely right. As we all know, Ghost will not be the first one to die. In fact, I could even make an argument that Ghost is more important than all the other direwolves. He finds the White Hand out beyond the wall. He alerts Jon when the White is attacking Lord Commander Mormont. Ghost is the one that finds the Dragon Glass and most likely the Horn of Winter out beyond the wall as well. And not to mention, Jon will most likely use Ghost as a vessel to keep his mind alive as his body is bleeding out. This will help Jon significantly during his resurrection, so that Jon can go on and be instrumental in the defeat of the White Walkers, but we shall see. Let me know your thoughts on this chapter. In my opinion, this one sets up so many things for the future of the series. As I said before, I may release a video this week about the connection between the Starks and the White Walkers, as well as the connection between Jon and Ghost. I have already made some videos where I laid out all the evidence, so I may update those, then release them to help add some context to the things I mentioned in the first 2 chapter videos. Also, I want to mention that I have made some new shirts that are on sale right now. If you are interested in grabbing one of these, there will be a link down below. If you do buy one, make sure you send me an email of a photo of you wearing the shirt. That way I can add it to one of my videos. Anyways, I want to thank everyone for stopping by to watch the video. As always, I really appreciate that. Hopefully you all come back to watch the next one. Have a great day. I will see you again very soon. Bye.